Hello! In this video, we're going to examine the importance of exercise intensity. We'll cover how it's possible to measure it, the relationship of exercise intensity with time, or sometimes called exercise duration, and also volume or the number of sets for an exercise. We'll look at how intensity relates to frequency of exercise, and this will set the stage for the next couple of videos on recovery and progression and how intensity regulates this. Before we look specifically at exercise intensity, let's take a quick look at the Oxford Dictionary definition so we can distance ourselves from common overuse such as, man, that was really intense. The first definition given is very close to what exercise intensity is. We could replace the word job with set, and it would be accurate. Exercise requires intense mental focus and concentration, as well as physical effort, of course. So, let's move on. To better understand intense exercise, let's first look at a range of activities. Notice the term activities and not exercise. An exact definition of exercise is required and will be very useful, but that's for another video. So you can see a chart of intensity of effort. On the y-axis, we chart percentage intensity, and on the x-axis, we can see there's a range of activities, starting with sleeping, which obvious the least intense activity you can do. Then we move to waking up, which is just a bit more intense, but really you're still resting. Then we get up, we stand up, or we stay standing, and moving from walking to jogging, then running, then finally sprinting requires a lot more intensity. So pretty self-explanatory graph, and you can see that the red line is an exponential curve showing the amount of effort that's required to transition from one activity to the next. So let's move on to the next slide and contrast that. So as you can see again, we have on the x-axis the same range of activities, but on the y-axis we have a hypothetical scale for duration. And pretty obvious, pretty self-explanatory. Again, we can see that you can sleep indefinitely, really. It doesn't take much effort. In fact, it's when your body heals. And moving from waking up to standing to walking, then to jogging, running and sprinting, you can do for shorter durations because it takes more effort. Again, pretty self-explanatory. And sprinting, something that's most individuals can't do for very long at all. It's an all-out effort. And you can see that this time for the red line is more of a logarithmic decay line. So the amount or the duration that you can, or the amount of time that you can do these activities falls each step. So just a contrast there, which really is to belabor a particular point, which we'll come to in the next slides. So this is the last chart that I'll be showing you, I promise, but it's a very important one. And you can see on the y-axis, again, we have intensity of effort. But on the x-axis, this time, we have the number of sets of a particular exercise that you may perform. This will either be in the gym or at home. And you can see that as the number of sets increases, you will naturally hold back on the amount of intensity that you put into that set, how hard you will exercise during that. And this is only natural if you know that you've got to perform 8 sets, for example, of squats, then you know that you're going to have to hold back a little bit on some of those sets so that you can get through that large volume. And as you reduce the number of sets, quite naturally, you can increase the intensity. So how many sets should you perform? Should you perform 3? Should you perform 4? Should you perform 8? Or just 1? Well, really, if you perform the set well, you only need to perform 1. Now, that doesn't include warm-up sets, which of course is a bit controversial because some people actually count those. I don't count warm-ups as my main set. I only do one set to failure because it does the job. But this chart is a very nice illustrator of the relationship between volume and effort. So this is quite an interesting question. Can you measure exercise intensity? You can, but there's only one real way that you can be sure, and we'll have a look at that next. So as this slide says, we can only really know 100% intensity by exercising the muscle or muscle groups to failure. We can't measure anything in between 0 to 100% objectively or accurately. I know there are certain scales which rate of perceived exertion, but they're subjective. One person may feel that they're working really hard. Somebody else may feel that it's not that intense. It's a relative subjective measurement. So you can only really objectively know if you exercise to failure because you couldn't work any harder. You'd worked as hard as you possibly could, unless of course you fake it, but you're only cheating yourself. So working to failure guarantees that you're working with 100% intensity. So if we examine this a step further and have a look at a practical example, you can see in the table here for a biceps curl set to failure. It's a hypothetical example, and we're assuming that the bicep has 500 total muscle fibers. So you can see those in the reserve here in the total. And to do one repetition with 35 kilos, and we're going to do it for 10 repetitions, this requires 200 muscle fibers to do each repetition, to lift the 35 kilos through one full range repetition. And we can see in the table that there's always 200 muscle fibers because that is all that's required to lift 35 kilos through the range of motion. And in our total, we have 500. And in the reserve at the moment, we haven't started the rep yet, there are 500 muscle fibers. So let's proceed through the set. And we're going to do 10 reps, as you can see. So the first repetition, well, for every repetition, there's just 200 muscle fibers. And after that one repetition, 20 of those fail. They become tired. They were probably active a lot during the day. And now we've got 20 that have failed, so we've only got 280 in reserve. And the total is always 500. Second repetition, 25 more fail. So we've got 45 total that have failed, and we have 255 left in our reserve pool. The reason we have a reserve, by the way, is because your body will never let you utilize every single muscle fiber to failure in your muscles. Otherwise, you would literally be, after your set, you'd be like a jellyfish. You wouldn't be able to perform any work at all. So the body is very efficient, it's very clever. It always holds back and keeps some muscle fibers in reserve to protect yourself. And as we progress through the set, you can see that more and more fail as those muscle fibers become tired, and we have to recruit more from the reserve to be able to keep performing that repetition. Now, the magic number is number 10, because here we have exactly 200 active and nothing else in reserve. 300 have failed, so the reserve is empty. So this is just this is a very, very difficult rep for us to do. We're becoming very tired. And finally, 50 more fail, and we hit that critical threshold, the failure zone. This is the magic zone, because we only have 150 muscle fibers, but we need 200. So we fail, we can't do any more. And this is the magic number, as I've just said, which sends a signal to the brain for reinforcement so that you'll build up and develop more muscle fibers in reserve for if this set ever happens again. So how many sets should you do to failure? You only need to do one. If you do the set, your main set or your work set as it's sometimes called, to failure, you won't want to do another set. If you want to do another set, you haven't exercised hard enough or to failure, or perhaps you're just a masochist. But one main set to failure is all that's required based on the example that I just showed previously. So, should you always exercise the muscle to failure? Ideally, yes. As a beginner, and we've all been beginners, you do make rapid progress. And as long as you're reaching your target rep range and you're gradually increasing the weight and making progress, and of course exercising intensely, you don't need to go to failure. But as you can see in the chart, eventually those gains or your results do dry up and you will start to need to go to failure, and you will also need to modify how often you exercise.